Okay, here we are with chapter 2 of the Gladiator's Day of Grace. I figured I better get out here now before I lose the rest of daylight. And these mosquitoes are coming out in droves and have already been taking chunks out of me. They are killers out here, but you know what? I figured you guys deserve this. I needed to make this sacrifice. This whole trip was a sacrifice in your behalf, so I make it gladly. I make it gladly. Okay, chapter 2. As soon as Maximus saw her, his feet propelled him in her direction. Watching her walk was like viewing a piece of moving art. She was wearing a soft yellow tunic, and her thick black waist-length hair was pinned back from her face and covered with a sheer, multicolored headscarf. With the sun adding a shimmer to her deep brown skin, she was more than beautiful. She was stunning, and her name suited her perfectly. Standing before him, tall and statuesque, Andromeda Ayana looked as breathtaking as the mythological Ethiopian princess she was named for. Ayana was a fitting name as well, for she was indeed a beautiful flower. Her mother and father had chosen well. Andromeda had been taken from her village when she was 9 years old and sold as a slave to a family in Ephesus. Maximus became well acquainted with Androcles Flaccus and his wife Octavia when he'd returned there to settle and start over. They were kind to Andromeda and had treated her fairly, and she had served them for 9 years when they presented her with a document of manumission, granting her freedom. Using the generous proculum she had saved through the years, she left to begin a new life. That was a year ago. Though Maximus knew that members of aristocracy involving themselves with slaves, even freed ones, for anything other than occasional tryst was frowned upon, he couldn't help it. He had been to where she was, so after questioning those servants closest to her, he boarded one of his own ships and followed. Andromeda was a Christian now and lived in Capernaum with a family of Christians who were relatives of the servant in Ephesus. In return, she assisted the ailing mother of 5 young children in caring for them. Whenever the husband was away, when Maximus had finally found her again, her expression upon seeing him was one of joyful surprise, as well as another emotion he could not discern. She seemed the same, but changed somehow. She was even more thoughtful than before, and her eyes held a wisdom beyond her years. Whenever they met now, her words were measured, guarded. Gazing at her as she stood quietly, it came to Maximus that it had not been Andromeda's beauty that drew him to her. In fact, most people overlooked her beauty. Most men did not see what he saw. What had drawn Maximus was a grace and kindness that radiated from within her. It had shone through her eyes, beautiful, deep, and haunting brown eyes that he seemed to see no matter where he looked. Whether waking or sleeping, Andromeda was there, always just beyond his grasp. She possessed a quiet strength, and she radiated peace and a tranquility that Maximus hungered for. All of these things were what made her the most beautiful woman in the world to him. He believed the feelings he'd harbored were futile, but he loved her most ardently for all that she was. And though Andromeda had never said the words or even encouraged him in any way, Maximus knew she loved him. It had been in her eyes, no matter how hard she tried to hide it, and it had given him cause to hope, a fool's hope, but hope just the same. Before Andromeda, Maximus had never known what true love was. He had never known what it felt like to be so consumed with desire for a woman that the hunger only grew each time he saw her. The desire quickly turned into embers of love that grew hotter until his heart ached and his insides swelled with longing for her. When Maximus was younger, he had no true sense of what it was to commit to one woman. In his immature mind, women were created strictly for the pleasure of men, and when he finally chose to marry, fertility would be celebrated and sons brought forth in his image. It was the way of things. Inwardly, he had paid homage to Eros, the Greek god of physical love, who was the son of Aphrodite and Hermes. For a while, he had let Eros rule him, giving the god complete control over his passions. Then, as he matured over the years, his morals were slowly reined in, and he began to subscribe to the favored goddess Artemis, whose temple stood prominently in Ephesus in all its glory. The goddess of eternal chastity, virginity, and fertility was loved by most Ephesians and many Romans, and he'd even visited the temple once. But Maximus soon learned that Artemis, as well as all the other gods and goddesses, offered only the illusion of influence in one's life. And the love he had once given to idols had been love given in vain with nothing returned. Now he was a different man, and the woman standing before him was life to him. Andromeda, he breathed and smiled. My lord, she responded, returning his smile shyly. He tilted his head, and his smile widened. You are doing it again. When she lowered her head, Maximus lifted her chin with his finger, forcing her to meet his eyes. I will no longer let you build walls between us by using a title. I will tear them down as swiftly as you erect them. He caressed her soft cheek, his voice low. Call me Maximus. She drew away from his hand and turned to face the sea, glancing sideways. You wish to ask me more questions, His chastening look cut her off, and she smiled. You have more questions? Maximus? Hearing his name coming from her lips was music. He could listen to her melodious voice forever, and it would not be long enough. He well remembered the first genuine conversation they shared. It had been evening, and being the personal maid for Octavia, as well as Octavia's daughter, who was visiting with her husband from Capua, Andromeda had been dismissed from her duties for the night. Maximus had dined with Androcles and Octavia and had just bid their host good night in the triclinium when he had encountered Andromeda sitting on a bench in a peristyle. She was dressed in a typical brown slave tunic, her hair braided and covered with a matching cloth, and she seemed to be lost in deep thought. Even though it had not been the first time they'd spoken, it was the first time he had been alone with her, and he was startled by the racing of his heart as he approached her. The moment she raised her soft eyes to him and smiled was the moment he had known pure joy for the first time in his life. She had moved to stand, but he gestured for her to stay seated. He joined her on the bench, keeping the space between them. For a moment, he had simply listened quietly to the flowing, tiled fountain. The sound was soothing. Are you well this evening? He asked her. Yes, my lord, she hesitated. And are you well, my lord? I am. Maximus leaned forward and pressed his palms together, both annoyed with himself and amazed that he could be so unsettled around a woman. During the Gladiator games, thousands of women had screamed his name. Whenever his training had taken him outside the ludus, both women and men ogled and practically threw themselves at him, sometimes falling at his feet in a fit of wanton excitement. Maximus had been disgusted by it all. Female slaves and prostitutes had been sent to his cell on occasion, a reward from the lanista for a job well done in training or battle. But he always told the guards to take them away. He would rather be celibate than give in to the primal urges that many other gladiators satisfied freely. Throughout his life, prominent women had always come to Maximus willingly. However, at that moment, the memory of falling into other wanton willing arms repulsed him, and he felt ashamed. He did not want to think of others. Pushing the faces away, he shifted his thoughts, focusing on the woman sitting beside him. "Will you tell me of your people, Andromeda?" he asked. "What do you remember?" For a moment he wondered if she would speak. Then her lovely brown eyes clouded and her mouth slowly curved downward. He could see her reluctantly remembering and felt slightly guilty for asking her, something that drew forth painful memories. "Both my parents passed away from this world when I was barely a year old, from a sweating sickness, my lord." "I assume there were family relations who stepped in to care for you?" "Yes, an aunt. She and her husband raised me with their daughters, who was a year older than I." "You must miss them," he said tenderly. She lowered her eyes, lacing her slender fingers together. When she spoke again, her voice was soft, pained. "It is difficult to miss being where you are not wanted, my lord." Maximus lifted her chin with his finger, and she started slightly, and he knew his action had caught her off guard. He was slow in removing his hand, reluctant to break contact. "What do you mean?" Tears slowly pooled in her eyes. "In my village, young beauty is prized, and many called me fair. My cousin was praised as well, but it was said that I had been blessed by my namesake. My aunt was not pleased. When the traders came through our village," she wouldn't say more. Feeling a swelling of stunned anger, Maximus stared at Andromeda, his eyes first widening and then narrowing as the truth turned over in his mind. "You mean your family actually gave you to the traders?" "No, my lord. They did not give me away, but they did nothing to stop it. My aunt even smiled." "So like Cepheus and Cassiopeia's daughter, you were sacrificed because of jealousy." According to legend, Cassiopeia boasted that her daughter, Andromeda, was more beautiful than the Nereids, the nymph daughters of the sea god Nereus. The Nereids frequently accompanied Poseidon, god of the sea, and as a punishment for the queen's arrogance, Poseidon sent a sea monster to destroy the coast of Ethiopia, including Cassiopeia's kingdom. King Cepheus sacrificed their daughter to the monster by stripping her naked and chaining her to a rock on the coast. Returning from having slain Medusa, Perseus happened upon Andromeda, killed the sea monster, set the princess free, and married her. Maximus smiled sadly. "Would that someone had set you free as Andromeda was freed. If he could, he would free her." At that moment, he actually contemplated offering to purchase her from Androcles, but knew he couldn't do it. Owning her, even just to set her free, was not an act he wanted to take. He had not purchased slaves even for his own villa, but had hired servants instead. He no longer believed in owning slaves. In a way, he never had. It had just been part of a society in which he was raised. Besides, he had learned what it was to have no control over your own life, to live according to the dictates of those in power. Maximus was so lost in thought that he was startled when Andromeda reached out and placed a hand over his in a gesture of comfort. "But I am free, my lord," she said with a soft smile. "I am more free here than I would be if I were still in my homeland." Sadly, it was the truth. It was a selfish statement. "It is a selfish statement, but I am glad you are here," he said, placing his other hand over hers and closing it. Dropping her eyes, she gave a slight shake of her head, and then she freed her hand and stood. "I should go, my lord." Maximus stood as well. "Maximus, call me Maximus." Andromeda looked away. It isn't proper. I say that it is. He moved closer and touched her face. Please, my lord, she said, closing her eyes, releasing a shaky breath. Don't be afraid of me, Andromeda, he said huskily. You never need to be afraid of me. She looked into his eyes then, and he wanted to fall at her feet and worship her. Instead, he took her hand again, kissed it, and let her go. Over the months, Maximus took every opportunity to see Andromeda, whether he was dining at Androcles' villa or the Flaccuses were dining guests at Maximus's villa. When they were, Andromeda always accompanied Octavia. He would sometimes glimpse the young maid at the market or when she was running personal errands for her mistress. He always stopped her and spoke with her for a few minutes. He appreciated the anonymity in Ephesus that made it possible for him to visit the market without being recognized by many fans of the games. Never fighting in the games in Ephesus had helped in that respect. Maximus's feelings for Andromeda continued to grow until love consumed him. Then she was granted her freedom and she left Ephesus. Drawing his thoughts back to the present, Maximus took Andromeda's hand. It was soft and warm and felt so delicate in his. Tell me more of Jesus, Andromeda. He squeezed her hand, his eyes pleading, the tone of his voice beseeching. Tell me of the Messiah's teaching. He hungered for the peace she possessed in abundance. He would need it desperately if he was to be free of the blood staining his soul. So there you have it. That was chapter 2. Tomorrow we are going to go on a tour of the Vatican City, and do St. Peter's Basilica and the Sistine Chapel. So I'm going to try to find another place to read chapter 3 to give you, another bit of scenery to go with it. But anyway, hope you enjoyed chapter 2, and we will see you again tomorrow.